The Luxor isn't just declining, it's rotting from the inside out. And the worst part? The people responsible can't even decide whose fault it is. Because when you slice a casino into pieces and sell it to different owners, one who holds the deed, another who runs the show, accountability becomes a ghost, a legal phantom, something no one can pin down. So let me be clear about what we're really talking about here. Bed bugs, electrical shocks, sewer smells wafting through hallways, structural columns left unfinished since 2010. A 2024 lawsuit where a guest was hospitalized after being eaten alive by bedbugs, and a lawsuit filed in January 2025 over an incident from November 2023, claiming a guest suffered brain damage from an electrical shock in their room. This isn't a casino anymore. It's a crime scene dressed up in neon. The Luxor opened in 1993 as one of the most ambitious resorts Vegas had ever seen. A 30-story black glass pyramid, a sphinx out front that could swallow a city bus. Inside, you had the Nile River. You had King Tut's tomb. You had hieroglyphics on every surface and boat rides through ancient Egypt. It was excessive. It was ridiculous. It was exactly what Vegas was supposed to be. But that was before the consultants showed up, before the corporate overlords decided theming didn't test well with focus groups, before Vegas stopped being fun and started being profitable in all the worst ways. By 2007, MGM Resorts decided the Egyptian theming was too kitschy, so they stripped it. 80% of it, gone. The Nile River, drained. The hieroglyphics, painted over. King Tut's tomb, turned into a nightclub. They called it modernization. I call it vandalism. Because what they really did was take the one thing that made Luxor unique and throw it in a dumpster so they could chase the same sterile, corporate aesthetic every other resort on the Strip was peddling, and the guests noticed. TripAdvisor reviews from 2008 and 2009 are full of people asking the same question. Where did Egypt go? But MGM didn't care, because they weren't building for the people who loved Vegas. They were building for the people who funded their quarterly earnings reports. And that's when the real decay started. Let's talk about what they took. In 1993, the Luxor was more than a hotel. It was an experience. You walked through the front doors, and you were transported. The entire ground floor was designed to feel like an archaeological dig site. There were artifacts, statues, ambient soundscapes of wind and distant chanting. The casino floor had a riverboat that actually floated guests to different parts of the resort. You'd climb aboard, glide past waterfalls and palm trees, and for a few minutes, you forgot you were in the desert. The rooms were themed too. Not aggressively, but enough. Egyptian artwork. On the walls, furniture that felt intentional, details. Then 2007 hit, and MGM decided all of that was dated, so they ripped it out. They replaced the Egyptian decor with beige wallpaper and generic furniture you could find in any mid-tier hotel in Omaha. They turned the boat ride into a walking path. They painted over murals that took artisans months to complete. One former Luxor employee, someone who worked there from opening day until 2010, posted on Reddit years later, and I'm paraphrasing, but the gist was this. Management told us theming was dead. Guests wanted modern, clean, simple, but what they really meant was cheap. And here's the kicker. The de-theming didn't even improve the guest experience. It just made Luxor feel like every other soulless resort on the Strip. A pyramid-shaped Holiday Inn with slot machines. Reviews tanked, repeat visitors stopped coming, and the property started its slow, inevitable slide into irrelevance. But MGM didn't course correct, they doubled down. Because by then, they'd figured out something even more profitable than running a good hotel. They figured out how to sell the building and still collect the rent. Here's something most people don't know. The Luxor has structural issues that date back more than a decade. Not cosmetic stuff, not chipped paint or worn carpet. I'm talking about unfinished support columns in the basement. In 2010, during routine inspections, engineers discovered that several support columns in the lower levels were incomplete, not cracked, not damaged. Incomplete, as in they were never properly finished during construction in the early 1990s. Now, I'm not a structural engineer, but I know enough to understand that when you build a 30-story pyramid made of glass and steel, you don't leave the foundation half done. That's not a detail. That's a catastrophe waiting to happen. And what did MGM do about it? They patched it, band-aided it, slapped some rebar and concrete over the worst parts and called it good enough. Good enough. That phrase should be engraved on a plaque in every MGM boardroom, because good enough has been their operating philosophy for the Luxor ever since. Good enough to avoid a lawsuit. Good enough to pass an inspection. Good enough to keep the doors open and the revenue flowing. But not good enough to actually maintain the property like it deserves. Not good enough to treat it like the iconic landmark it once was. And if you think incomplete basement columns are the worst of it, wait until you hear what guests have been living through. Let's get uncomfortable. In 2024, a guest filed a lawsuit against the Luxor, claiming they were hospitalized after suffering severe bedbug bites during their stay. Not just a few bites, not just an itchy night. Hospitalized. The complaint alleged that the infestation was so bad, the guest developed an infection that required medical intervention. Photos submitted with the lawsuit showed bites covering their arms, legs, and torso. Dozens of them. Angry red welts that looked like something out of a medical textbook. And here's what makes this even worse. This wasn't an isolated incident. If you dig through TripAdvisor, BBB complaints, and online reviews from 2023 and 2024, you'll find a pattern. Guest after guest reporting bedbugs, some with photos. Some with stories about switching rooms only to find the same problem. Some who said they complained to the front desk and were told, housekeeping will take care of it. One review from July 2024 said, and I quote, found bedbugs on the second night. Asked to switch rooms. New room had them too. Front desk offered a $50 resort credit. $50. For bedbugs. $50. That's not compensation. That's an insult. And the thing is, bedbugs aren't just gross. They're a sign of systemic neglect. Because bedbugs don't infest a property overnight. They spread slowly, room by room, floor by floor. And the only way they get that bad is if housekeeping isn't checking, maintenance isn't treating, and management isn't paying attention. Or worse, they're paying attention and just don't care. Because when you're MGM Resorts and you're juggling a dozen properties and the Luxor is your budget tier bargain basement option, why spend money on pest control when you can just offer $50 credits and hope the problem goes away? Spoiler, the problem didn't go away. It got worse. Now let's talk about the lawsuit filed in January 2025 that makes bedbugs look like a minor inconvenience. A guest filed a claim alleging they suffered a severe electrical shock in their Luxor hotel room back in November 2023. The shock was allegedly so severe, it caused neurological damage. Brain injury, the kind of injury that doesn't heal, the kind that changes your life forever. The lawsuit claims the shock was caused by faulty wiring that hadn't been properly maintained, wiring that, according to the complaint, should have been flagged during routine safety inspections. But here's the question no one seems to be asking. If the wiring was that dangerous, how did it pass inspection? Was there even an inspection? Or did someone sign off on paperwork without actually checking? Because that's what happens when you run a property on the absolute minimum budget, when you're cutting costs at every turn. When the goal isn't excellence, it's just avoiding catastrophe long enough to collect the next rent check. And if you think I'm being dramatic, consider this. Electrical fires, faulty wiring, These aren't hypothetical risks. They're documented hazards that kill people every year in older buildings that aren't properly maintained. The Luxor was built in 1993. It's over 30 years old. And if MGM has been running it on a shoestring, budget since 2007, what else hasn't been updated? What else is one bad day away from disaster? I don't know. And that's the scariest part. So here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean infuriating. In 2022, Vici Properties completed its acquisition of the Luxor property from MGM Growth Properties, MGM's real estate spinoff. The $17.2 billion deal had been announced back in 2021. Vici now owns the land and the building. But MGM still operates the casino. They lease it back from Vici and run the day-to-day operations. This is what MGM calls an asset-light business model. They get to shed the financial burden of owning real estate while still collecting revenue from running the casino. Sounds smart, right? For MGM, maybe. But for the Luxor, it's a death sentence. Because now you have two separate entities with completely different incentives. Vici owns the building. They want the property to hold value long enough to collect rent and eventually sell it again. But they're not in the hospitality business. They're in the real estate business. They don't care if the carpet is stained or the HVAC is broken, or there are bed bugs in room 1427. And MGM operates the casino. They care about profit margins, about keeping labor costs low, about maximizing revenue per square foot. But they don't own the building, so why would they invest in long-term maintenance? Why would they replace old wiring or upgrade infrastructure when they're just renting? They wouldn't, and they haven't. This is the accountability gap, the legal loophole that lets both companies point fingers at each other while the property rots. Guest complains about bed bugs? That's an operations issue, MGM's problem. Structural columns are incomplete? That's a real estate issue, Vici's problem. Except neither company actually fixes anything, because neither company has to. The legal and financial structure allows them both to profit while the Luxor deteriorates. And the guests? The people paying 60, 70, 80 bucks a night to stay there? They're the ones who suffer. Let's look at the timeline, because the timeline tells you everything you need to know. 2007. Luxor is de-themed. 80% of Egyptian decor is removed. Guest satisfaction scores start declining. 2010. Structural issues with unfinished basement columns are discovered. MGM patches them but doesn't fully repair. 2021. MGM announces the sale of Luxor property to Vici Properties as part of a $17.2 billion deal involving MGM Growth Properties. 2022. Vici Properties completes the acquisition. MGM continues operating under a lease agreement. 2023 to 2024. Guest complaints spike. Bed bugs. Broken HVAC. Sewer odors. Electrical issues. TripAdvisor ratings drop. BBB complaints increase. 2024. First major bed bug lawsuit filed. Guest hospitalized. 2025. Electrical shock lawsuit filed over a 2023 incident. Guest claims brain injury. You see the pattern? The Luxor didn't collapse overnight. It decayed. Slowly, deliberately. Because for nearly 2 decades, no one with the power to fix it had the incentive to care. And the data backs this up. If you cross-reference TripAdvisor reviews, BBB complaints, and legal filings, you'll notice a sharp uptick in health and safety complaints after 2022, the year Vici completed the acquisition. Coincidence? Maybe, but I doubt it. Because once the ownership split was finalized, MGM stopped pretending to care about the building's long-term health, and Vici never cared to begin with. Let me read you some reviews. These are real, pulled from TripAdvisor and BBB complaints over the last 2 years. Stayed 3 nights, AC didn't work. Complained twice. Never fixed. Room smelled like mildew. Bed bugs. Switched rooms. Found more bed bugs. Front desk offered resort credit. Never staying here again. Shower wouldn't drain. Water pooled on the floor. Smelled like sewage. Asked to change rooms. They said they were fully booked. Elevator broke down twice in one day. Took the stairs from the 15th floor. I'm 73 years old. Paid $65 a night and got what I paid for. Dirty, loud, depressing. These aren't cherry-picked outliers. These are the norm. Page after page of guests describing the same problems. Broken infrastructure, poor maintenance, staff that either can't help or won't help because they're overwhelmed and under-resourced. And here's what gets me. These are people who chose the Luxor because it was affordable. Because Vegas has become so expensive they had no other option. They're not trust fund kids slumming it for the story. They're retirees on fixed incomes. Families trying to make a vacation work on a tight budget. Regular people who just wanted a clean room and a hot shower. And the Luxor couldn't even give them that. Let's zoom out for a second. Because the Luxor isn't the only property suffering under this model. It's happening all over Vegas. All over the country, really. REITs, real estate investment trusts, were created to allow average investors to pool money and invest in real estate without having to buy entire properties. In theory, it's a good idea. Democratizes real estate investment, spreads risk. But in practice, especially in the casino industry, it's a disaster because REITs are publicly traded, which means they're beholden to shareholders. And shareholders care about one thing, quarterly returns, not long-term property health, not guest satisfaction, not preserving historic landmarks. Quarterly returns. So when Vici Properties completed the acquisition of Luxor in 2022, they didn't buy it because they wanted to run a great hotel. They bought it because it generates reliable cash flow. MGM pays rent every month. Vici collects. Shareholders are happy. But what happens when the roof starts leaking? When the HVAC system is 20 years old and on its last legs? When guests are complaining about bed bugs and electrical hazards? Vici doesn't care because they're not in the hospitality business. They're in the real estate business. And as long as MGM keeps paying rent, the property is performing exactly as intended. And MGM doesn't care either because they're operating on razor-thin margins. They're trying to squeeze every dollar out of the Luxor while spending as little as possible. Because they don't own it anymore, why invest in a building you're just renting? This is the shell game, the financial engineering that lets both companies profit while the property crumbles. And the only people who lose are the guests. So let's talk value. Because that's the question, right? Is the Luxor still worth it? You can get a room at the Luxor for $60 to $80 a night depending on when you book. Compare that to the Bellagio, where rooms start at $200, or the Cosmopolitan, where you're looking at $300 minimum. On paper, the Luxor is a steal. It's affordable. It's on the Strip. It's got a casino, a pool, restaurants. But here's the thing. Cheap doesn't mean value if you're staying in a room with bed bugs, if the AC doesn't work, if the shower smells like a sewer, if you're worried about getting electrocuted every time you plug in your phone. At that point, cheap just means cheap. And you're not saving money. You're paying to be uncomfortable, to be stressed, to spend your vacation wondering if the building you're sleeping in is even safe. I'm not saying don't stay at the Luxor. That's your call. But go in with your eyes open. Because the property you're staying at isn't the same one that opened in 1993. It's not even the same one that existed in 2007. It's a gutted shell, a corporate experiment in how little maintenance you can do before the lawsuits start piling up. And if you're okay with that, if you're willing to roll the dice and hope your room is one of the good ones, then sure, $60 a night is a deal. But if you're expecting the Vegas experience you remember, the magic, the charm, the feeling that you're somewhere special, you're going to be disappointed. The Luxor didn't have to end up like this. It could have been maintained, updated, respected. It could have kept its Egyptian theming and leaned into what made it unique. It could have been a landmark, a piece of Vegas history that future generations pointed to and said, that's what made this city great. But instead, it became a cautionary tale, a case study in what happens when you prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability, when you split ownership and accountability until no one is responsible for anything, when you treat a property like a disposable asset instead of a living, breathing part of the city's identity. The Luxor is still standing. The lights are still on. The casino is still running. But it's not really alive anymore. It's a zombie, a corpse dressed up in neon, shambling through each day until someone finally decides it's not worth keeping around. And when that day comes, when MGM or Vici or whoever owns it next finally pulls the plug, no one is going to be surprised, because we've all been watching it die for years. If you remember when the Luxor was something special, when Vegas had properties that took risks and told stories, tell me about it in the comments. And if you want more truth about how Vegas really changed, hit subscribe. Because this city has a lot more stories to tell, and most of them aren't pretty.